A fight for their survival. Syrian rebels are trying to hold their ground as government troops close in on Aleppo. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and the UAE say they'll send ground troops. Could that tip the balance? What does the fight for Aleppo mean for Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. It's the clearest example yet of the impact Russian bombing is having on Syria. Hezbollah and other fighters loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, backed by Russian air power, are advancing on Syria's largest city, Aleppo. Well, the fall of Aleppo could be a significant setback for rebel forces. They've managed to hold on to much of the city since 2012, but could find themselves now completely surrounded. Well, Syrian government forces are trying to cut off rebel supply lines to Turkey. They're now about 25 kilometers away from the Bab es-Salama border crossing with Turkey. The Assad government trying to consolidate control over the town of Kefane. From there, it hopes to advance towards the main rebel stronghold of Tel Rafat. Government forces want Aleppo surrounded. With the help of Russian air power, they've been advancing towards the town of Kafr Hamra. Al Jazeera's Zeidan has more from the Turkish-Syrian border.
Aleppo province is strategic for both sides. For the opposition, it lies on Turkey's border. Turkey, a backer of the opposition, really allowed the rebels to have a link to the outside world. They're able to bring in reinforcements, aid supplies, whatever they need. Now, for the government, sealing that border is their objective because that would weaken the opposition, and the government is advancing towards the border with Turkey. They are now approximately 20 kilometers from Bab es-Salami. This is the border crossing in Aleppo province. And they're also trying to advance to another opposition-controlled border in the province of Idlib. And they're advancing from the southeast of Aleppo. They're trying to cut through territory in Idlib. They're still far from achieving that goal, but undoubtedly this is an objective. What the government is also trying to do is encircle the rebel-controlled east of Aleppo. This they will be able to recapture Aleppo city. It is highly unlikely that the government is going to send in troops to the neighborhoods controlled by the opposition because they do lack manpower and it would cause a lot of casualties. What they will do is lay a siege, and eventually people will starve and surrender. We've seen this tactic used on other front lines across the country. But more importantly, Aleppo, for the opposition, really, it's the last remaining stronghold for groups linked to the Free Syrian Army, or what the West calls the moderate rebels. If they are weakened or defeated here, then the government would be telling the world, you have two choices. It's us or the terrorist groups on the ground, i.e. ISIL and Syria's Al-Qaeda branch Al-Nusra. So the moderate rebels really are fighting for their survival. Like I said, it's their last remaining stronghold. What the government wants to do is weaken them on the ground, weaken their voices in any political negotiations. The government wants a military solution to this conflict. It believes if it has the upper hand on the ground, it has the advantage on the negotiating table. Zeidan for Inside Story, Gaziantep.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have in Jeddah, Jamal Khashoggi, Editor-in-Chief of the Al Arab News Channel. In London, James Denselow, Research Associate at the Foreign Policy Centre. And joining me from Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran. Welcome to you all. Let's start with Jamal. What do you make of this? Is Aleppo the make or break of the Syrian war?
It will be a major blow for the revolution if it falls into the sectarian hands of the militias and Iran and the regime. But it will not end the revolution. We should remember the revolution is not about territories. It's about the idea of freedom. The people of Syria want their freedom, and they will continue to struggle even when they come under the iron fist of the government and the sectarian militias of Iran. So it's basically about freedom, and the plight of the world to search for a solution to Syria will continue even if the regime succeeds in taking Aleppo.
Do you think it will fall though, Jamal?
I there will be a fierce resistance. The Russians are very ugly. They are carpet bombing the area. No one is holding them accountable. They did that in Chechnya. Why not? They could do it in, God forbid, in Aleppo. But it is our responsibility in the world to make them stop this massacre they are doing. 600,000 refugees are about to go into Turkey, to add to the 4-point-something millions. It is a shame to the world to let this happen. It's very shameful for the whole world, for us, the Saudis, for the Turks, for the Americans, to let that happen.
Mohammad Marandi, what's the view, do you think, amongst Iranian authorities? Are they looking at Aleppo as a key turning point in this battle?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that over 60% of the city is held by the government, and the people in the areas held by the government come under regular shelling from the extremists on the other side. Yet that is rarely noted in the mainstream Western media. Almost the whole area surrounding the city is also held by the government. So it's not a rebel-held city, and the word rebel itself is very misleading. 80% of the forces that were fighting in western Aleppo and southern Aleppo over the past few weeks were the Nusra Front. And the Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda in Syria. So basically those Western outlets that are saying the moderates, they're basically calling the same people who's carried out 9/11 and who carried out bomb attacks in London and other parts of the world as moderates.
But hang on, Mohammed, you're not suggesting that all of those
comprehend.
Opposition parties or groups which are currently fighting against the Syrian regime, Aleppo, are all a Nusra Front? You know that there are many factions there in Aleppo and the area surrounding. Have nothing to do with the Nusra Front.
No, the overwhelming majority are either Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda allies. And this is nothing new. In 2012, the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, General Flynn, he admitted, his agency admitted, that the dominant forces that are fighting against the Syrian government in Syria are the extremists. This is early on in the fighting. This is what Iran was saying all along. So this is nothing new. But the point is that Western governments, for their own sake, they basically are trying to call these forces moderates. Basically what the Free Syrian Army does is that they are based near the border. They get the arms from Western sources and other sources, and then they distribute them. That's why most of the advanced American missiles, they ultimately are in the hands of the Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam, which are all extremist groups that either are Al-Qaeda, like the Nusra Front, or allies to Al-Qaeda.
Oh, all right, hang on. I can see Jamal is shaking his head there before we go to James. Go ahead, Jamal. I think you want to come back on some of those points. Are all of the groups either extremists or their allies, basically? And Nusra and Al-Qaeda and their allies who are fighting for Aleppo and getting American weapons, apparently.
That's what basically the Iranians want us to believe. They're all terrorists, so let's kill all the Syrians who resist Bashar al-Assad. As simple as that. And that's exactly what they are doing. Everybody who disagrees, everybody who stands against Bashar al-Assad and his regime and they want a free Syria is a terrorist, let's bomb him. That is basically what Muhammad is arguing. If that is true, why not the Syrian people are not siding with...
exactly what General Flynn said.
Okay, let Jamal finish and then we'll give you a chance to come back in.
I said the dominant force. Jamal, I said the dominant force.
Half of the Syrian population have left Syria. If the choice was between Bashar al-Assad, the secular, and the extremists, I'm sure the Syrian people will choose the secular leader. But they did not. They are standing with their revolution. They are supporting their rebels, their fighters. But they are coming under heavy bombardment by the Russians, ugly sectarian attacks by the Iranians. So they are fleeing the land. They are fleeing their own land of thousands of years. So it's just unfair to label the Syrian revolution as Al-Qaeda revolution.
Okay, James, whatever happens in Aleppo, is it the end of the armed conflict, or do you expect these groups to find a way to continue, but just change the strategy, the tactics? Do they become more of a guerrilla operating force rather than groups that try to hold large civilian areas?
Well, I think you should be very wary about predicting the future course of this conflict. It has mutated a huge amount in the last 5 years since it began. And of course, I want to be careful not to find myself in the middle of an argument between an Iranian and a Saudi on Syria, because clearly there is a huge amount of disagreement as to the very basic terms that define what is happening beneath the fog of war.
I'm afraid, James, when you speak about Syria, you're already in the middle of an argument. So I'm going to have to ask you to get right into it. And I mean, part of the problem, you're right, is defining who is an extremist. That's an issue that has bedeviled the talks in Geneva.
And I've said before, I think it's very hard to be a moderate in such an extreme environment. And I think the rumours of Aleppo falling to one side or the other have come and gone over the last few years. Clearly what we're seeing in the last 10 days is a significant change as to the facts on the ground. However, Russian air power, it can win villages, it can dominate in rural areas. Whether it can win a city is a different question. Whether it can win it without destroying it is another question. And we have seen, as your correspondent Zaina Huda very eloquently put, the sort of fear that siege tactics will be used again on a far larger scale there, as we have seen recently in Madaya, as we've seen in Yarmouk and other parts of the country. I think the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister has already said that the siege on Aleppo has started. Opposition factions have begun to stock fuel and food. And of course, we've had a huge humanitarian conference in Europe over the last week. They raised a record amount, $10 billion, towards the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and that number might suddenly have to go significantly higher.
Mohammad Marandi, this is not the first time, of course, that Syrian regime forces, with the support of Iran, have tried to make a push for Aleppo. In October last year, Iran announced the deaths of 4 high-ranking officers from the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, or IRGC, and at least one of them, Brigadier General Hussein Hamdani, we're told, lost his life near Aleppo. What's changed the dynamics this time? Has the crucial factor been the Russian air bombing campaign?
I think the Russian air campaign has played a significant factor, but I also think that the mood in the world is changing. Ever since the attacks, the second attack, especially on Paris, and then the attacks in the United States, and the other bomb attacks in Turkey and elsewhere have taken place, the mood has changed, especially with large numbers of refugees traveling to Europe. Europe is now reassessing the situation. On the other hand, the Russians and the Chinese are very concerned about Wahhabi extremism that the Saudis export, whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria or Al-Shabaab in Somalia or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. The ideology of Wahhabism, they all have the same ideology, which is born in Saudi Arabia. And even the deputy German chancellor recently said that Saudi Arabia must stop exporting Wahhabi extremism.
Can we come back to the point here?
Mosques...
What's made a difference on the battlefields for Aleppo?
Well, I think the major difference is that in the past we had tens of thousands of extremists that were brought into Syria from across the world, thanks to Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other allies who have been breaking international law from day one by creating this civil war in Syria. But now the Syrian government has greater support from both Russia and Iran and Iraq. And as I said, countries across the world are moving away from Saudi policy. Even in North Africa, we see that Wahhabism and ISIL and other extremists are becoming a threat to Egypt. They're becoming a threat to the whole of North Africa. And these countries do not want to see this situation continue. So whether it's ISIL
so how is that changing?
Front,
I'm finding it difficult, Mohammed, to follow the point. How is that changing the battlefield situation in Aleppo? Are you saying that there are less non-Syrians coming into Aleppo, and that's been the crucial factor, not the Russian air campaign?
No, I'm saying that the Russian air campaign and support from countries like Iran, they have been able to effectively counter the fact that these tens of thousands of people have come in from across the country, and now the tide is turning.
Okay, Jamal Khashoggi, you want to get in on that? What is, in your opinion, has that been the changing, perhaps, key factor as Mohammad Marandi would put it, increased support from Russia and Iran, but also the world is changing in how it views Saudi policy.
The Russian entry made all the difference. The regime was losing, along with the Iranians and Hezbollah, rapidly in the summer. The rebels, the revolution was making headways even to the coastal areas that even Latakia appeared within reach. So that a deal was struck between Bashar al-Assad. We all remember his secret clandestine trip to Russia, where he signed an agreement that was revealed in the Financial Times, which puts Syria under Russian form of control, intidab, what is the word in English. So that's what made the tip, that's what made the difference. The Russians come in heavily with their airplanes, carpet bombing, their advisors. So they bomb civilians, and the Iranians and the regime do the dirty work and move on the ground. It's basically that. But again, it is not about territories. It's about the spirit of the revolution. The people of Syria want freedom.
Okay.
They did not call for Wahhabism when they started the revolution. They called for freedom and democracy, and they're going to continue in doing so till they achieve
Jamal,
freedom and democracy for all of Syria.
I want to put that point to Mohammed very briefly, Mohammed, so we don't get bogged down in this too much. But do you think in the thinking of officials in Iran, do they recognize that there is a legitimate Syrian opposition, that there is any semblance of a legitimate Syrian revolution? Is it really only either, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, or Bashar al-Assad?
Well, unfortunately, the Saudi regime has made it as such. And I agree with Jamal, the people of Syria against Wahhabism and the extremist groups like Nusra and others. The point is that from the very beginning, the Iranians were calling for reform in Syria and for dialogue.
No, but my question, Mohammed, is there a legitimate Syrian opposition? Are the Syrians or some Syrians also against the Bashar al-Assad regime as well as Wahhabism?
That's exactly what I'm getting to. From the very beginning, the Iranians, when they supported the Kofi Annan plan in 2012, they were trying to bring in the legitimate Syrian opposition, people who were critical of the government, both inside and outside the government, to establish dialogue with the Syrian government so that reforms can take place. But the Turkish government and the Saudis and others, they thought that they could steamroll into Syria. And that is, we saw that from 2011, weapons were coming in from Libya. Extremists were coming into Turkey and in the name of the Free Syrian Army. And U.S. documents basically admit that.
All right.
I really call on your
it's interesting
viewers
to hear.
Look at the Defense Intelligence Agency document in 2012.
All right. It's interesting to hear a guest in Tehran referencing U.S. documents. So that's a first for Inside Story. James Denselow, there's been a lot of talk in Gulf Arab states about trying to perhaps send ground troops into Syria. Do you think that's a real option? Are any Sunni states really able or willing to put their ground troops in Syria?
Well, as I say again, I mean, a few years ago, if you'd said that by today we'd have Russian airplanes and American airplanes both bombing different parts of Syria, it would have been very hard to predict that. I think we are seeing an increasing regional conflict being fought in that country. It's interesting that many of the fighters that are involved in this push on Aleppo are not even Syrian. So you're hearing about Iranian generals, Chechen special forces, Lebanese militias, Iraqi militias, Afghan militias. And it shows you how the conflict has become sort of part of this wider conflagration between various powers there. So
in other words, you're saying it's very possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rhetoric is there already. And if we have the regime moving further up to the border with Turkey, Turkey seems to be in the process of creating a de facto safe haven beyond its border. It's not allowing huge amounts of refugees through. It's already allowed in millions. And that could, of course, change the security balance and dynamics there. We've seen in the past, in the 90s, the Turks and the Syrians come close to blows. And, of course, more recently than that, aircraft being shot down by either side. So that is a real possibility. How the Saudis and the Gulf states could find themselves themselves more involved, is slightly harder to predict whether that is air power, supply of weapons, or this rather larger shift, which would be the introduction of ground forces. Yet does not seem possible at this time, but things are changing quickly.
Jamal, some good points made there by both of our other guests. If Saudi Arabia or any of the Sunni states send their troops in, what would the mission be? I mean, we heard a moment ago from Mohammad Marandi. It sounded like he said there is a legitimate opposition in the view from Tehran. There is something of a legitimate revolution against Bashar al-Assad. Would Saudi Arabia's troops be there simply to fight ISIL or to try and help elements of that Syrian revolution against Bashar al-Assad? It's a very tricky question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But we should not expect an answer from an Iranian to determine who is legitimate in Syria and not, because they are participants from day one in fighting the Syrian people. They labeled all the Syrian people as terrorists, and they've been, as Bashar did from day one of the revolution, and they've been supporting him as all along.
Okay, but coming back to the question, Jamal, what would the mission be for Saudi troops?
The mission, I think it is the Americans. I think the Saudis are telling the Americans, we are ready to send our troops to Syria. What the Saudi did not say is, what are you going to do about it, the Americans? How are you going to come along with us? We are, I think, challenging the Americans, because the Americans are not doing their duty and what they are supposed to do to protect the Syrian people. So the Saudis somehow are kind of challenging the Americans and asking, showing our readiness. The Americans have been always critical of Saudi Arabia, that we are not doing enough to fight ISIS. And here we are saying we are willing even to send troops. Are you willing to send troops along with us? So that's what will be debated in Brussels tomorrow and the day after.
Do you think there's a risk, Jamal, that Saudi Arabia could end up in a conflict with Iranian forces, with perhaps even Russia, if it sends its troops
in? Very much. There is a risk of that. It is just like landing a plane in an airport that has no runways and no lights and nobody except hostile forces. Yes, it is a risk, but it is more of a risk to let the Iranians win in Syria and have a hegemony over that Arab land.
Okay.
That is more of a risk to us.
Well, I want to give a brief to Mohammad Marandi. You know, a question that people often ask is, what is the vital interest for Iran in Syria? Why is Iran backing a regime that has been condemned by so many UN and human rights organizations as killing its own people?
Well, the Iranians believe that the Syrian government, with all its attributes, is infinitely better than what the extremists that the Saudis and the others have to offer. And let's be fair to the Muslim world. This is not a Sunni Shia conflict or a Sunni Alawi or Sunni Christian conflict. This is a Wahhabi conflict against everyone else. Saudi Arabia and Yemen is destroying the country.
But Mohammed, the United Nations, forgive me for interrupting, on the 16th of September 2014 said the Syrian government remains responsible for the majority of the civilian casualties. I mean, it seems UN and human rights organizations have pointed more of a finger at the Syrian regimes while admitting all sides are committing mistakes. Do you think that's perhaps a point?
Well, we know that the United Nations is dominated by the United States and its Western allies. This is something that Al Jazeera has traditionally been complaining about over the conflict with the Israeli regime for a very long time now. So it's not as if it's an unbiased body. The head of Human Rights Watch,
sir, but the UN General Assembly's Human Rights Committee passed a resolution which was passed by 115 countries condemning, quote, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran and militia groups such as Hezbollah.
And we also know that the Malaysian Prime Minister received $680 million in bribes from the Saudi regime. We know where these votes come from. But the problem is that the Saudis are really making a grave mistake now. They are committing crimes in Syria and Yemen and across the board, and they're spending their money like there's no tomorrow. The Saudi riyal is facing huge difficulties
Mohammed,
right now.
10 seconds. 10 seconds left. Let me give Jamal a brief 10 seconds so he doesn't feel like a... Go ahead, Jamal, brief 10 seconds before we have to wrap up the show.
what we have in Syria is a struggle between freedom and tyranny. Saudi Arabia, Iran, United States, should not do anything but support freedom.
All right, well, Jamal,
it's not a Saudi issue. It is not an issue. It's an issue of freedom.
10 seconds is up, I'm afraid, gentlemen. I know this discussion can go on. It's been a good discussion. Thank you all for coming here. Jamal, James and Mohammed. And thank you for watching. Of course, you can get more on our programme page of our website, aljazeera.com, or our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join us on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me and the whole team, for now, it's goodbye.